Guardians of the Galaxy is a great movie, and a lot of people are singing its praises. Spoiler alert, I really like the movie, but I'd like to talk to you about why. Specifically, I want to talk about something that I don't believe a lot of people were talking about, and that's the use of orientation and theme in this movie. This time around, James Gunn really nailed a feeling with this movie that really lended itself to the slower pace, and while most people think the strength of this movie is in the character development, I believe the real reason it works so well is because of orientation. If you've seen any of my earlier videos, you might know what orientation is, but for the uninitiated, here's a quick explanation. Orientation is a question, but it isn't just any question. It's a question that can stop the conversation at a dinner table. This question is what drives the narrative of the story forward. And the answer to this question is what brings about the final confrontation and resolution. So what is the orientation for Guardians of the Galaxy? I believe the question is, can our friends be the only family we need? So think about this for a minute. The entire story is about family. Everyone has that arc. Star-Lord and Ego, Gamora and Nebula, Yondu and Star-Lord, Rocket and Groot, Drax and Manus. Every story thread in this movie is connected by that single question. It is what contributes to the film feeling like a cohesive whole instead of a disjointed mess like most of these other comic book movies. So if the theme is still driving the emotion behind the story, what is the theme for Guardians of the Galaxy? One would be inclined to say love, but that would be too terribly generic for a film that is this out there, and no one is actually falling in love with one another. I mean, not even Gamora and Quill. I mean, love is a prerequisite of family, and these people are already a family whether they want to admit it or not. No, the theme here is belonging. Let's take Yondu for a great example of this. Yondu is exiled from the Ravagers for having taken Peter Quill as a child, and a part of the Ravager code is that you never take children. You can tell this exile hurts Yondu deeply, and that he looks on Starkar Ogord, fucked up name, as a father figure in his own right, because his rebuff on the robot horror planet seems to wound Yondu deeply. He wants to belong once again to the family that exiled him, but instead they have completely forgotten him and left him behind. To make things worse, Yondu is then captured and his leadership usurped by his own crewmen. Yondu, along with Rocket, are thrown into prison. He has now lost all of his ties to the only family he has left, and the only person that is left is Rocket, Kraglin, and Quill. Yondu has by far the greatest arc in the movie, and I would go even so far as to say that this is Yondu's movie, as the thread between Star-Lord and Ego is weak at best. The real meat here is the scene where Yondu reunites with Quill, and they hash out their feelings. You know, Quill still believes naively that Yondu has only kept him around because he was small and can crawl into tight spaces. Yondu lets it be known that his love for Quill in his own hard-edged sort of way, and that the moment Yondu saves Quill's life at the end, the moment where he dies in space, it's earned for a couple of reasons. Not just because of the fact that Yondu is well developed and because we knew how he really felt about Peter, but because of how many times he has let him get away with things that they would have killed anyone else over, but also because Yondu is forced to watch his entire crew be thrown out the airlock to die in space. Yondu was willing to do the same at the end of the movie for his son. It's a perfectly orchestrated moment, and James Gunn deserves a hell of a lot of credit for bringing humanity and character back to a comic book movie. The moments between Gamora and her sister Nebula are decent and help fill out the runtime, but they're not the highlight of the movie. I would say the surprisingly strong moment in this movie is between Drax and Manus. I mean, without Drax explaining anything, he simply looks out onto a beautiful pool of water, tells Manus that it reminds him of his family, and when Manus, a character that can see the memories of those he comes into contact with, touches Drax, she begins to cry. Without Drax spouting exposition, we know how he feels about his dead family, and all we want for Drax is to see him get his moment alone with Thanos. Even moments between the two brothers, Rocket and Groot, are memorable and at times downright adorable. John Truby said that archetypes can transform how your characters work. It's true that every character in this film is from a stereotypical archetype, with a few exceptions. For instance, Ego is appropriately enough a part of the king or father archetype, which says that the strength in the archetype is that he leads his family with wisdom and foresight, but his weakness is that he's a tyrant that forces his family to act in accordance to his whims and needs. Ego fits this archetype perfectly in that he kills any of his offspring that do not live up to his expectations. Ego is one of the weakest characters because of this. See, if we didn't have a scene where we all saw all of Ego's dead children, then Ego would have simply been driven by a misguided sense of perfecting the universe in his image, Like God, right? Another arc could have been in place that allowed us to sympathize with the devil, in that bringing about his utopia may destroy the lives of the universe, but it would eliminate war and suffering. We wouldn't agree with his methods, but the need for peace is something that I think we can all sympathize with. Showing Ego as an even bigger, uncaring monster weakens Quill's arc a bit, in that Quill has no tough choices to make. Killing the man that so carelessly tossed aside the lives of his children is a no-brainer. But if we felt like Ego truly cared about Quill, that would have made Peter's choice that much more difficult to make. Drax is of the warrior archetype in that his strength is in his ability to fight for what he believes is right, be that revenge for his fallen family, or to keep alive his surrogate family. His weakness is in his brashness and his kill or be killed attitude, exemplified in his willingness to jump inside of an interdimensional slug monster. His arc is interesting because we see that tough exterior, it'll fall away through someone else's eyes, even though Drax never shows his hand, not for 1 minute. His dedication to toughness is admirable, and the love that hides inside of him makes him lovable. With the small amount of screen time dedicated to that arc, James Gunn and Batista managed to do a lot. And Yondu is definitely the wise old man archetype in that he is looked up to by his crew and he certainly benefit from his wisdom, but in his weakness he's forced them all to live with his mistakes. Gamora and Nebula are offshoots of the warrior archetype, and their moment comes in a small break of anger to their tenderness in the end. Their arc is forgiveness. The arc is weak because it has less time to percolate. When dealing with a tough character who is weak inside, that weakness must show through the cracks, like with Drax. But here we don't see it in Gamora. Instead, we see it in Nebula, which is admirable, but if there was more of a need to reconcile this whole relationship on Gamora's part, the story thread would have been tied up a little more tightly by the end. Instead, Nebula ends up stealing the show from Gamora. And Quill is like a blend between the trickster and clown in that he uses the confidence and trickery of the trickster and can often show people their own weakness through his humor like the clown. In the earlier film, he was in danger of only looking out for himself like the trickster, but has since adopted the weakness of the lover in that he loses himself in his unrequited feelings for Gamora and later makes her stand in the shadow of Ego. Ego becomes the only family figure that returns the need of love that Quill needs. This is where we start to see the archetypes break down a bit, and Quill in this movie is probably the least interesting. Could it be that he did not conform to an archetype, or that his arc was the least interesting? Probably a combination of both, but this is not the only reason. Everyone gets their moment of closure, but not because of who they are, but in their relationship to one another. How a character reacts to another character, how they interact, what they choose to do for another, is what fully defines who they are. And this story, being driven by the question of family, forces the characters to develop their interactions with one another. Here we see the true power of that question, the orientation. The power of it is that in order to answer the question, we must force our characters to answer it for us. To do this, they must come into conflict with one another. They have to come into conflict with themselves. The question forces the conflict, and in the end, the answer to the question is shown through the fireworks and Yondu's late re-entry into the family of the Reavers. Peter finding out who his real father is, and best of all, a teenage tree monster that never cleans his room. This has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you've heard it, go be creative.